Long before the rise of Rome, before the glory of Greece, there stood a mighty kingdom, built not in Europe, but on the banks of the Nile. A kingdom forged in black stone, red sands, and unshakable pride. They called it Kush, but history would try to call it nothing at all. Most people have never heard of it. Ask a classroom about ancient Egypt, and hands shoot up. Ask about Nubia, and silence answers. But make no mistake, Nubia was a civilization of kings, of queens who led armies, of warriors who stared down the greatest empires the world had ever known. And sometimes they won. Its story begins over 3,000 years ago, in the deep heart of Africa, where the Nile splits the desert like a silver vein. Here, black-skinned people carved cities from stone, mastered iron before most of the world, and built monuments so vast they rivaled the pyramids of Egypt. But Nubia's greatest power wasn't in stone. It was in spirit. The spirit of a people who refused to bow. To Egypt, to Rome, to erasure. Geographically, Nubia stretched from modern-day southern Egypt into northern Sudan. It was rich in gold, ivory, incense, and ambition. While Egypt saw Nubia as a land to conquer, Nubians saw themselves as kings in their own right. And one day they proved it. You see, Kush was not a quiet neighbor. They traded, they learned, they watched. And when Egypt began to weaken, Kush rose. This is the part of African history they tried to erase. But we're here to tell it. All of it. Before Rome ever stepped foot in Africa, Nubia was already an empire. It had cities like Napata and Meroe, brimming with temples, iron workshops, and libraries. Yes, libraries. Black African scholars, writing in their own script, ruling with their own laws, worshipping their own gods. And when Egypt collapsed into civil war, the Kushites did the unthinkable. They marched north and conquered Egypt. Yes, black African kings ruled as pharaohs. They didn't just invade, they united the Nile and ushered in Egypt's 25th dynasty, known by history as the Black Pharaohs. But they won't teach you that in most schools. They'll skip that chapter, or call it a footnote. But we're not skipping anything. The man who led the charge was King Pi, a Kushite warrior pharaoh. He rode across the desert with a vision, not just of conquest, but restoration. He believed Egypt had lost its way, corrupted by greed, split by infighting. So he came not only with armies, but with purpose. King Pi didn't destroy Egypt. He renewed it. He rebuilt temples, restored laws, and in his own words, he ruled not with fear, but with justice. He left behind inscriptions not of bloodshed, but of balance. It was a new golden age for both Egypt and Nubia, but golden ages never last. From the west, a new threat was rising. Rome, expanding, relentless, merciless. They had conquered Carthage. They had taken Greece. Now their eyes turned south, to the land of gold, to the kingdom of Kush. But Nubia would not be so easy to break. Imagine this: a black king, standing atop the great temples of Thebes, his crown glinting under the desert sun as priests of Egypt bow before him, not as a conqueror, but as a pharaoh. This was not a fantasy. This was history. In 747 BCE, a Nubian warrior named Pi looked north and saw a broken Egypt, divided, corrupt, crumbling under its own weight. The gods, he believed, had turned their backs on Egypt, but Pi had not. He wrote in stone, "I am not one who acts without divine command. I was sent by Ammonius himself." So, with the blessing of the gods, Pi marched across the desert, across the Nile, across history. His army didn't just fight, they liberated. City after city opened its gates, not in fear, but in respect. They had heard of this king from the south, a king who prayed before he fought, who offered peace before war, but when challenged, struck with the fury of the gods. He was not like the others. When Pi entered Memphis, one of Egypt's sacred cities, he didn't burn it to the ground. He went to the temple. He prayed. He thanked the gods. And he left the priests in place. He wasn't there to rule Egypt like a foreigner. He was Egypt. And Egypt finally had a ruler worthy of its legacy. Thus began the 25th dynasty, a line of black pharaohs from Cush, who wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and walked with pride through the halls of their ancestors. After Pi came his brother Shabaka, a powerful general who secured Nubian rule even further. Then Taharqa, the greatest of them all. Taharqa's name still echoes in stones and scrolls. He was crowned at just 20 years old and ruled over one of the largest empires of his time. From the sixth cataract of the Nile to the shores of the Mediterranean, he was king of Egypt, of Nubia, of legacy. Under Taharqa, temples were rebuilt, new cities were planned, trade flourished across Africa and the Mediterranean. He sent gold to Babylon, gifts to Palestine, scholars to learn, priests to teach. This was not just rule. This was Renaissance. And he never forgot his roots. He spoke in Nubian dialect. He worshipped African gods. He built monuments in both Egypt and Cush, equal in glory. This wasn't Egypt ruling Nubia. This was Africa ruling itself. But the gods test greatness. From across the sea, Rome's ancestors stirred. But before them came the Assyrians, the world's first military superpower. They burned cities, crushed kings, and marched with cruelty. And in 674 BCE, they came for Egypt. The Assyrian king sent wave after wave. But Taharqa, son of Cush, stood firm. He fought like a lion. He pushed them back. Twice. Even when they captured the north, he ruled from the south. From Thebes. From Napata. From the heart of Africa. And the people still called him Pharaoh. Eventually, the Assyrians overwhelmed the Nile. But they never conquered Taharqa. Even in retreat, he held his kingdom. And he passed it on. The Nubian dynasty lasted for nearly 100 years. 100 years of black pharaohs. Of African glory. Of written history they don't want to talk about. But it happened. It's real. And the ruins still stand, if you care to look. From Pi to Taharqa, from Napata to Thebes, a flame of African power burned bright. And even when enemies tried to extinguish it, the spirit of Nubia never died. They thought Africa would kneel. They were wrong. This is the Forgotten War, when black warriors stood face to face with the mighty Roman Empire and didn't flinch. This is the story of Meroe, the Iron City, the last jewel of Nubia, and the queen who defied Caesar. Centuries had passed since the glory of Pi and Taharqa. Egypt was no longer free. It had become a Roman province. Its temples desecrated, its gods mocked, its gold stolen. But deep in the south, beyond the cataracts of the Nile, Africa was still sovereign. Cush still breathed, still ruled, still remembered who they were. At the heart of this empire stood Meroe, a city built of red sandstone and black iron. Its streets rang with the sound of hammers and drums. Its walls bore images of lions, warriors, and gods with African faces. And ruling over it was a queen. But not just any queen. A Kandake. In Kushite tradition, Kandake was no ceremonial title. It meant warrior queen, mother of the king, defender of the throne. And around 25 BCE, Rome would meet one of the fiercest Kandakes in African history, Amanirenas. She was not tall, she was not young, and she had lost one eye in battle. But her spirit? Unbreakable. They say she rode into war herself, on the back of an elephant. Sword in one hand, shield in the other. When Rome crossed the Nile and demanded tribute, Amanirenas did not send gold. She sent a message. She marched her army north. Her soldiers were fierce, archers so precise they could blind a man at 100 feet. iron weapons forged in the furnaces of Meroe, drums beating like thunder across the desert. They stormed into Roman territory, sacked city after city. Even Aswan, Rome's southern gate, fell, and in a move no Roman ever expected. Amanirenas captured a bronze statue of Caesar himself. She dragged it back to Kush, cut off its head, and buried it beneath the temple steps. So every time her people prayed, they walked on the face of Caesar. Now that's power. Rome was humiliated. Augustus, the emperor of emperors, demanded revenge. But when the Roman general Petronius counterattacked, Amanirenas didn't flee. She didn't kneel. She regrouped. Her warriors struck back again and again, using the desert as their weapon, their speed as their shield. It was not a war Rome could win easily. Months passed, then years, and in the end, Augustus made a decision rarely seen in Roman history. He signed a peace treaty. Yes, Rome made peace with a black African queen, and not just any peace. Rome agreed to white heavy checkmark withdraw its forces. White heavy checkmark recognize the borders of Kush. White heavy checkmark end all taxes on the Candace's people. No tribute, no surrender, only respect. The war lasted 5 long years. But Amanirenas never lost her capital, never lost her spirit, and never gave Rome the satisfaction of conquest. She returned to Meroe, not as a survivor, but as a victor. And the people sang of her for generations. She who blinded Rome. She who stood when others bowed. History rarely tells the story of the women who led nations. Even rarer are the stories of black women who defeated empires. But Amanirenas? She wrote her name in fire, and though the sands have covered her palace, her legacy lives on. In every queen who dares to fight, in every people who refuse to bow, and in every African heart that still walks on Caesar. They called it the land of the bow, but this was more than a land of warriors. This was a land of artists, scholars, queens, kings, and blacksmiths. A land where science danced with spirit and architecture rose like prayer. This was the golden age of Meroe. After defeating Rome, Queen Amanirenas returned home, not to rest, but to rebuild. Under her legacy, Meroe flourished like never before. This was not a land surviving in the shadows. This was a civilization shining in its own light. Imagine a city where the streets echoed with the sound of ironwork, where temple walls shimmered with sacred paintings, where women held power, and black children were taught to be kings. At the center of it all stood Meroe, a city of pyramids. Yes, pyramids. More than 200 of them still rise in the Nubian desert today, smaller than those in Egypt, but built with purpose, precision, and pride. Each one a royal tomb, each one a whisper of a forgotten dynasty. And unlike Egypt, here, many of those buried were women, queens, Candaces, warriors, and mothers. Meroe was more than just royal. It was a hub of technology. Its iron smelters were legendary, furnaces that turned black rock into weapons, tools, and treasure. So powerful was their industry that ancient travelers called it the Birmingham of Africa. But this society wasn't built just on war. It was built on wisdom. The Kushites had their own writing system, Meroitic script, one of the oldest written African languages in history. Even today, much of it remains untranslated, a silent library waiting to be heard. How many poems? How many prayers? How many names have been lost? Because no one ever taught us how to read our own ancestors. They built temples to gods like Ammonius and Epidmac, a lion-headed war god, unique to Nubia. They honored the Nile not just as a river, but as a giver of life. And their rituals? Their culture? Their fashion? It inspired neighbors from Egypt to Ethiopia to even Arabia. Women in Meroe held real power. They owned land. They led armies. They served as priests. They chose kings, and sometimes became them. In some cases, the candidate didn't just influence the king. She was the king. Imagine that, a black queen, crowned in gold, commanding generals with one hand and leading ceremonies with the other. This wasn't fantasy. This was history. Their art spoke of balance. Their monuments spoke of eternity. And their lives? They were in rhythm with the stars. The Kushites observed celestial movements, followed lunar calendars, and aligned temples with the heavens. They were not tribal. They were astronomers. While Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, here in Africa, Meroe was glowing. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was the spirit of independence. They were not ruled by Rome, not colonized by Greece, not begging for survival. They ruled themselves, defended themselves, educated themselves, and they did it all with black hands. So why? Why is Meroe not taught in schools? Why are its pyramids not shown in history books? Why do we know Caesar, but not Amanirenas? Why do we speak of Athens, but never Meroe? Because what Meroe proves is that black civilizations were not just surviving. They were thriving, building, writing, ruling, fighting, dreaming. Long before colonization, long before slavery, there was greatness. The Renaissance didn't start in Europe. It started here, in the red sands of Nubia, in the golden light of Meroe, and its heartbeat still echoes. Meroe stood proud for centuries, a jewel in the desert, a living symbol of black brilliance. But as with all great empires, time began to shift, and with it came cracks in the golden walls. The Nile, which once blessed Meroe with abundance, began to change course. The lifeblood of Kush drifted away, turning once green lands into dry silence. Agriculture suffered, trade slowed, and the iron furnaces that once breathed like dragons began to fade. As internal struggles grew, so did threats from beyond. New powers were rising. To the east, Aksum, a rising African empire in what is now Ethiopia, began expanding. Led by King Ezana, Aksum was hungry for dominance, and Kush, weakened by drought and instability, became its target. In the 4th century CE, Aksumite armies marched west. They didn't just come to conquer. They came to erase. The city of Meroe was attacked, its temples desecrated, its leaders overthrown, and its memory, slowly, strategically, buried under the sands of time. King Ezana, after defeating Meroe, proudly inscribed his victory in stone, in Greek, no less, boasting that he had subdued the people of Kush. One empire rose as another fell. But something more sinister happened after the war. The history of Meroe vanished. For centuries, textbooks didn't mention the queens who fought Rome. They didn't speak of the pyramids taller than stories. They didn't show the iron smelters, the Meroitic script, the female rulers, the temples aligned with the stars. All of it disappeared from mainstream history. But why? Because the story of black power, real, independent, unstoppable black power, didn't fit the narrative being written by colonial powers centuries later. When European empires began carving up Africa, they built a myth that Africa was dark, savage, without history, that it needed civilizing, that it had given nothing to the world. But Meroe proved otherwise. It proved that long before Europe's rise, Africa had cities, queens, scripts, science, art, and governance. Meroe wasn't just a footnote. It was a threat to the idea of African inferiority. So it was buried, ignored, forgotten on purpose. European explorers in the 19th century stood before the Nubian pyramids, amazed. But instead of preserving the sites, many looted them, removed royal artifacts, smashed ancient tombs in search of gold. They didn't see history. They saw treasure. Even today, museums in Europe hold pieces of Meroe, stolen, and displayed without context. Meanwhile, African children grow up never hearing the name Amanirenas, never being shown their own pyramids, never being told about the cities their ancestors built. This wasn't just historical oversight. It was erasure. The same colonial institutions that praised Roman emperors and Greek philosophers made sure the world forgot about the kingdoms that once defied them. The Nubian script remains mostly undeciphered, partly because the world never invested in decoding it the way it did with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Generations of African scholars were denied the tools to rediscover their past. Meroe became a ghost, not because it failed, but because it succeeded, and that success had to be hidden. The fall of Meroe wasn't just military. It was political, psychological, a deliberate removal from the collective memory of the world. But the stones remember. The pyramids still stand, quiet but defiant, in the desert winds. Their angles are sharp. Their stories are still etched into the sandstone. And they are waiting, not to be discovered, but to be heard again. Across Sudan today, archaeologists continue to find clues, inscriptions, pottery, temple ruins, and burial chambers. Each discovery adds another piece to the truth. A truth that was never lost, only silenced. Meroe teaches us something powerful. It shows that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes, it's rewritten by those who fear the truth. And that truth is this: Africa was never waiting to be discovered. It was always awake, always building, always leading. And Meroe was its heartbeat. The story didn't end with the fall. The blood of Kush still runs in modern Sudanese communities. The symbols of Kandake queens still inspire black women reclaiming their power. The pyramids, now studied with pride, are no longer foreign. They are African. They are ours. And the silence around Meroe is breaking. More and more scholars, content creators, and storytellers are shining light on this forgotten kingdom. Not as a mystery, but as a mirror that reflects African excellence back into the eyes of those who were never meant to see it. And with each new voice that tells this story, the erasure begins to crumble. History doesn't belong to the empires that wrote it. It belongs to those who lived it. The fall of the Moors in 1492 wasn't just a military loss. It was the closing of a chapter that had changed the very soul of Europe. But what did they leave behind? For nearly 800 years, Black and Muslim rulers of African descent ruled vast parts of Spain. They didn't just build cities. They built futures. They planted seeds of science, medicine, and philosophy that Europe would later claim as its own. Al-Andalus, what Muslims called Islamic Spain, became the envy of Europe. While most of the continent lived in superstition and fear, Moorish cities shone with libraries, observatories, hospitals, and gardens. In Córdoba, streetlights lit the roads, centuries before London or Paris would see the same. Over 70 public libraries served not only the elite, but also common citizens. Philosophers walked among merchants. Mathematicians debated beside poets. The Moors translated ancient Greek texts into Arabic, then into Latin, preserving knowledge that Europe had lost. They introduced surgical instruments still in use today. They revolutionized hygiene with public baths and taught that cleanliness was tied to faith. They brought citrus fruits, cotton, silk, and rice into Europe, changing diets, trade, and agriculture forever. But more than what they brought is what they represented. They showed that black rule could be brilliant, that civilization didn't belong to one race or religion, that Africans didn't need saving. They were the ones doing the saving. This truth, like the truth of Meroe, became a threat. After the fall of Granada, a systematic effort began to erase Moorish history. Black faces were removed from paintings. African influence was rewritten as Arab. Mosques were converted into cathedrals. Arabic names were Latinized. and the word Moor became synonymous with enemy. The Inquisition made it a crime to speak Arabic, to wear traditional dress, or to keep Moorish customs. The past was burned, literally, but not all could be erased. Architecture remained. Its intricate patterns, based on geometry and symmetry, reflect a worldview of balance and divine order. The Giralda Tower in Seville, now part of a cathedral, was once a Moorish minaret. Even flamenco, Spain's national dance, carries deep Moorish and North African roots. The Moors never truly disappeared. Their fingerprints are everywhere, if you know where to look. And their bloodlines? They still exist. Many Spaniards today carry North African and Sub-Saharan African DNA. Centuries of intermarriage created a population that was as mixed as it was mighty. But pride in that heritage was replaced with silence. Silence taught in schools. Silence reinforced in culture. But history has a voice. In recent decades, a new movement has risen, led not by institutions, but by the people. Artists, historians, scholars, and everyday storytellers have begun to reclaim the Moorish legacy. Documentaries, novels, spoken word poetry, YouTube channels, TikToks, museums, reenactments, songs. The silence is breaking. Because this isn't just Spain's story. It's Africa's story. The Black world's story. A reminder that we were not always enslaved. That we were not always colonized. That we once ruled, and ruled well. Children of the diaspora, long disconnected from their roots, are finding new strength in the truth. Learning that their ancestors weren't just survivors, but visionaries. That their story didn't start in chains, it started in palaces. In the U.S., in Brazil, in the Caribbean, where millions of descendants of Africans live today, the story of the Moors is becoming a tool of healing. A weapon against lies. A light in the fog of historical distortion. To learn about the Moors is not to fantasize about the past. It's to understand what was taken and what must be reclaimed. It's to walk into the future with pride, knowledge, and clarity. To say, without apology, we built, we ruled, we mattered, and we still do. Because the legacy of the Moors is more than castles and calligraphy. It's a spark that reminds us that history is not a straight line. It twists, it turns, it hides, but the truth is stubborn. It waits, it survives, and when spoken, it roars. So when you hear the name Moor, don't just think of old paintings or medieval battles. Think of Black brilliance. Think of forgotten kings. Think of mothers teaching algebra before it had a name. Think of cities that glowed while the world slept. Think of resistance. Think of endurance. Because history, real history, isn't just what's written in books. It's what lives in us. And now, we write it again.